Everyone has those Pokemon lines that they just can't be around. Like for me, my limits are humanoid Pokemon and ones that have bits that wiggle uncomfortably. The first one is because it just feels weird to have something that looks so human that you can see them acting like a person because oftentimes they have pretty good intelligence, and then just treat them like you would any other Pokemon. It feels strange to do. And as for the second one, think of things like Pukamuku or Dugtrio. Just the wiggly, tube-like or tentacle-like parts are just so gross, I can't do it. It's the main reason I only had Miltanks on my farm for about 3 weeks before I had to get rid of them. I couldn't handle the udders. But my point is that everyone has things like that. After looking into this Pokemon line, I find that they fit nicely into both of my categories. Wonderful. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the long-tongued Pokemon Lickitung and its evolution Licky. Lickitung is a bipedal Pokemon with a rounded pink torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs. It has yellow slashes across its stomach as well as yellow rings on its knees. As well, it has a large pink tail and a rounded head. And yes, it often has its tongue hanging out of its mouth. Its tongue, which the species is known for, can stretch to be almost 6 feet long and is used by the Pokemon as an exceptionally prehensile limb. Oh, and it's also covered in a layer of saliva that is both sticky and smells bad. It's just a lovely image to have. These Pokemon tend to stand just under 4 feet tall, or 1.2 meters, and weigh about 144.5 pounds, or 65.5 kilograms. And to top things off, this Pokemon is at the end of its line. Once a Lickitung is able to learn the move Rollout, it triggers the genetics and they evolve into a Licky. Licky stands at about 5 feet 7 inches, 1.7 meters, and clocks in at over double the weight of its first evolution, now being 308.6 pounds or 140 kilos. Licky keeps the same general body plan as Lickitung, just somehow getting more round. Its skin has a deeper pink hue, and the yellow slashes that were across its belly before now look more like a deep yellow Wi-Fi signal, with a white pattern extending from its neck down to its chest. Its tail is also much smaller, and it has appendages on the top of its head that look a lot like a pompadour hairstyle. And it still has the massive tongue, which now can stretch immensely. I think the record that I saw while looking up this species was near 80 feet. And yes, it is still covered in the same sticky, smelly saliva that its pre-evolution had. Ugh, it's just sickening. But I'm sure there are people out there that aren't as grossed out by these Pokemon as I am. And to those of you, I welcome you to listen to the rest of this guide and see if this Pokemon line could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. There isn't that much to say in this section. Despite how strange their biology is, their enclosure isn't that weird. The main place that they live are forests, and since they don't really need any environmental factors like humidity or high levels of heat, you can keep them in your backyard pretty easily. The only major thing that they need is a big water feature. With the amount of saliva that these Pokemon generate over the course of the day, they have a massive water intake over that day. But that would be the bare minimum, which I would not recommend. With the fact that these Pokemon's saliva is so irritating to bare skin, which, by the way, is something I didn't mention in the intro, their saliva causes massive irritation to the human skin, you really wouldn't want to let them have full run of the yard. Instead, you want to section it off in its own part of your yard, essentially giving you 2 yards. One will be the human yard that you and any family members you have ready access to, and a second yard that functions as this Pokemon's enclosure. Like I said before, these Pokemon tend to stick to forested areas, mainly because of one reason: their skin. See, these Pokemon don't have any fur or hair on their bodies, just soft, squishy pink skin. And just like the palest of humans, they burn pretty easily in direct sunlight. So, they've adapted to live in more forested areas, where they get a lot of shade under the trees. It's also where they'll find their preferred prey of small bug-type Pokemon. You'll have to plant some trees or set up the enclosure in a space that has some trees already. Keep in mind the round and large stature of these Pokemon, especially Licky. If the trees are too close together or there's too much undergrowth, then these Pokemon will have a hard time moving between the trees and getting around in general. You need the trees that are spaced out enough that the Pokemon can get around, large enough to provide enough shade over a large area, and no undergrowth. Unfortunately, that means they need to be situated in old-growth forests, where the trees have had a long time to grow and settle themselves in. That will, unfortunately, mean that you have to take years to get the enclosure set up, or you need to import and plant trees that are already well grown, which can be a major expense. But it's what's needed for these Pokemon. As for how big the enclosure should be, it'll need to be fairly large. After all, these Pokemon are comparable to a human in size. For a Lickitung, you'll need something that is 75 to 100 feet on all sides, or 22 3/4 of a meter to 30.5 meters. Licky, with how much bigger they are, will need something that is at least 150 feet on all sides, or nearly 46 meters per side. Thankfully, these aren't the most active Pokemon. Their feeding method and the fact they don't like to go too far from water at any given point means that they are very sedentary overall. If they were much more active, then they would need a much bigger enclosure. Speaking of water, these Pokemon need a water feature wherever they live, and I would recommend one that is always flowing and being filled. These Pokemon produce and use a lot of saliva throughout the day, from using it to mark their territory, using it to coat their own bodies to help protect them from the sun, or using it to help with eating their prey. They use a lot of fluid throughout the day. Because of that, they never stray too far from a place where they can get a drink and refill, if you want to think of it that way. It doesn't need to be deep or even really that big, since these Pokemon aren't aquatic at all, but it's going to have to be constantly refilled. Your easiest bet would be to have an actual river nearby and have some of it diverted into a small pond in the enclosure, but I know that's unrealistic to the majority of people. What you're most likely going to have to do is dig a small pond and run a hose out there and leave it there. Then, every morning and night, turn it on and fill it up completely. Not the most advanced or clean way to do it, but it's the most realistic way that the average person is going to be able to do it. You'll have to install a filter in the pond as well, just to keep it free of dirt and make sure the water doesn't get nasty over time. You'll also have to clean it every now and then as well, but we'll cover that more in the care section later on. Winter is also something that you should keep in mind. If you live in an area that experiences any kind of severe cold months, where plants start to die off and leaves fall off the trees, then you should provide these guys with a shelter that they can hibernate in. Yes, these Pokemon actually hibernate for the winter. Their prey Pokemon go dormant, water freezes over, and the leaves fall from the trees, meaning they have no cover from the sun. Thus, the best solution that nature has is to put the Pokemon into hibernation for the winter months. To that end, you'll need to provide the Pokemon with a place where it can avoid any of the hardships of winter while hibernating. A small space, no bigger than a small shed or garage should do, so long as it's heated to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit or about 4.5 degrees Celsius. Warm enough to not freeze, but not warm enough that'll mess with your Pokemon's hibernation. Add in some water for if the Pokemon wakes up at any point, and you should have a good shelter for your Lickitung evolution to ride out the winter. Just be sure to check on them every now and then to be sure they're okay. Last are the Pokemon that can be housed with the Lickitung line. Realistically, you want to avoid anything that isn't a Lickitung evolution. Small Pokemon, especially small bug-type Pokemon like Caterpie or Spinarak, are liable to become prey to these Pokemon. But beyond that, any Pokemon that has bare skin come into contact with these Pokemon's saliva is gonna get an irritating rash and have a reaction. I suppose that a few Steel-type Pokemon that have metal bodies might be able to deal with it, but even then they have eyes and mouths where the saliva can get past that metal hide. The only Pokemon that won't be affected by it might be some of the more caustic poison types like Grimer or Trubbish, but then they would certainly have a negative effect on your Lickitung's health, so even then it's not a good idea. I would only recommend that you house other Lickitung evolutions with them, and even then, not too many. They can handle being together in small groups, but they're more on the solitary end of the social scale. And always remember that the enclosures that I set out for you here are only built to accommodate one Pokemon at a time. If you get more, then be sure to expand to accommodate them. Availability. Funny enough, despite being in the Kanto Pokédex, they don't have a native population in the region. In fact, they don't have very many native populations at all. Kanto, Hoenn, Paldea, and Galar are all without a major population. And then, even the ones that do have populations of these Pokemon, they aren't that widespread. Johto only has a small population on Route 44, as well as being occasionally stocked in the Safari Zone outside Cianwood City. They occasionally appear at Lake Valor in the Sinnoh region, but Route 215 has a much more stable population of them. They're in Alola at the Pony Gauntlet on Pony Island, Victory Road in Kalos, and they used to be contained in Challenger's Cave in the Unova region, but since the relaxation on imports, they've since expanded to Route 2 outside Striaton City. Great, near my parents' house. All very isolated and small populations, and even when you're in spots where they can be found, finding one can sometimes be pretty tough. They aren't the most numerous Pokemon out there, meaning you could end up spending quite a bit of time just looking for them. Of course, you'll have much more luck finding them in warmer months than the colder ones, since the species should be asleep in their dens at that point. If you do encounter a Lickitung evolution during the winter, be careful. It could be sick. It's best to report it to the local authorities and then move out of the area as quick and as safely as possible. As for getting one from a breeder, it's gonna be pretty hard to do. These Pokemon don't enjoy the best of reputations among people thanks to their rather disgusting biology. And thanks to that, they've become a much more niche Pokemon to keep, and a lot of breeders write them off as not being worth the effort to raise since they don't get enough of a return on their investment. All that is to say that if you want to get one of these Pokemon from a breeder, then you'll need to put in a lot of effort to find one of the out-of-the-way breeders that are actually raising and selling these Pokemon. Catchability. The main thing you want to remember when you go out to catch one of these Pokemon is to protect yourself. Not just in the normal way, like bringing a Pokemon to protect you from wild ones, or to be prepared for the wilderness or stuff like that, which, just to be clear, you should still do, but to protect yourself from this Pokemon's saliva. Their tongue is the main way these Pokemon protect themselves, and with that being the case, saliva is going to fly everywhere and get on everything. If it gets on you, it's going to cause a pretty nasty rash that you'll have to go to the doctor for. So, you should wear long sleeves and long pants, boots, gloves, and something that'll cover your face. As well, you should be sure to have a plan to take your Pokemon to the nearest Pokemon Center for treatment, because it's going to cause a rash for them as well. Aside from all that, your best bet for Pokemon to battle and protect you from these Pokemon are fighting types, as those are the only kind that'll be super effective against the normal type Lickitung evolutions. Pokeball-wise, a Great Ball should do good for a Lickitung, though an Ultra Ball might be better. They're right on the cusp between the two, really, And, of course, Licky will absolutely need an Ultra Ball. Care. A major part of how you're going to interact with these Pokemon is protecting yourself from their saliva. After all, nobody wants to have a Pokemon that's going to send them to the doctors every time they get near it, looking at you, Grimer people. And so, anytime you enter the enclosure to do anything, whether that be cleaning, feeding, or just to spend some time with your Pokemon, you will need to be fully kitted out. Just like I mentioned before in the catchability section, you should have full body coverings that'll prevent the saliva from getting to your skin. Gloves, pants, long sleeves, the works. If even one drop of this saliva gets on your skin, then you will need the doctor. Aside from that, interacting with these Pokemon is really pretty easy. They have average intelligence, average temperament. It'll really be your average training routine. I feel like I've been saying this quite a bit lately, but I wouldn't recommend that you start cuddling these Pokemon, but you can easily get to the point where they're very excited to see you and they run up to you and you can just kind of hang out with them. Food is an area where a lot of you might get turned off from these Pokemon, though if you've made it this far into the guide and haven't gotten turned away yet, then maybe not. These Pokemon are actually ambush predators, believe it or not. Thanks to their long tongues, they are very good at staying in one place, and when prey wanders too close, they lash their tongues out and entrap them. Licky is even better, since their tongues can stretch to an incredible 80 feet or 24 1/3 meters. But, as is the common case with ambush predators like this, just setting out the food for them in their enclosure won't really do it for them. You need to do one of two things. Live prey, which has its risks. Even if the prey Pokemon is significantly weaker than your Pokemon, they still might be able to do some damage to your Pokemon before they get eaten, which is never a good thing. Plus, a lot of people just don't have the stomach to feed a living creature to another. To that end, you'll need to essentially puppet the food around so that your Pokemon is willing to strike at it. The best way to do this is to set it up almost like a fishing line. Get a rope and tie a quick release knot around the body of the prey. The best one that I found online for this would probably be the Highwayman's knot, as it can come undone with a sharp, hard tug. Then, once you have your food on a string, enter the Pokemon's enclosure, find your Lickitung evolution, and start fishing. Gently toss the food in the general direction of the Pokemon, and then slowly reel it in. This will drag the food across the ground of the enclosure and look like the prey Pokemon is alive and just walking around. It may take a few tries where you have to rethrow and reset the bait, but eventually your Lickitung evolution should strike with their tongue. They'll wrap their tongue around the prey, and at this point you can give the rope a yank and the knot should fall away, allowing you to pull the rope out of the way as your Pokemon pulls the food into its mouth. It's a rather macabre dance, but it's the most effective and best way to feed these kinds of Pokemon. If, after the first couple of throws, your Pokemon doesn't show any interest in the food, then wait a couple hours and try again later. Thanks to the way they eat, it may take them a while to feel hungry again after a meal. As for what you should be feeding them, the best prey for them would be a whole Caterpie or anything of equivalent size, like Scatterbug or Grubbin. Because of the fact that they eat so much in one meal, you should only be feeding a Lickitung once a day, if that. Like I said, that's a lot of food all at once, so they might take some time to digest it. As for Licky, they are much larger, but they still feed on the same prey, so feeding them will only be slightly different. You'll need to increase the amount of food to 2 whole prey Pokemon per day, but you're still going to feed them all at once. Once they eat the first prey Pokemon, then you should immediately start trying to get it to eat the second. It should go for it, as these Pokemon very much stuff themselves when they eat, but if it doesn't, then be sure to try again a couple hours later. This will fluctuate if you have to deal with the winter and hibernation. When the seasons begin to turn and get colder, then the Pokemon will slowly start requiring more food, so that they can pack on the weight. This is completely normal, and should effectively double the amount of feedings as winter begins to set in. Then, as they're hibernating, you won't have to feed them at all, and when they awaken in the spring, then you can return to a normal feeding schedule. There are a few minor things that you're going to have to take care of with these guys. One is cleaning. Of course, you'll have to clean up after the Pokemon itself, but you'll also have to be sure to keep their water source clean as well. Thanks to their saliva, the pond can end up getting kinda gross, like backwash. This can lead to health problems if it isn't addressed, so about once every 2 weeks, you should drain the water from their water source, pulling any saliva water with it and replacing it with fresh water. I know you'll be filling it every day, but that could easily leave nasty stuff in the water otherwise. As well, you should bathe your Pokemon about once a week or so. Not only will this prevent your Pokemon from smelling, thanks to covering itself in its saliva all the time, but it will also help keep your Pokemon healthy. Plenty of things can get stuck on the saliva coating on the Pokemon's body, and if they stay there or get licked up by the Pokemon, then they can end up causing health issues. If you don't see anything major that stands out as a health risk, then you can stick to the once a week schedule. But if they get especially dirty or something sticks out as a health risk if the Pokemon licks it, then you should bathe them right away, even if you just bathed them the day before. It might be a pain in the butt to handle, but it could be the difference between your Pokemon staying healthy or a trip to the Pokemon Center. Cost. The cost of the enclosure is really going to depend on what your land already looks like. Do you have a bit of forest on your land already? That's going to bring down the price. Do you have a natural river that runs through or along your property? That too is going to bring down the price. If you don't have to do any major terraforming and just need the hibernation shelter and fencing, then I can see this being in the moderate category. But if you need to buy the trees and install the water feature, then it could easily shoot up to the very high category. I also don't see this Pokemon costing you too much to acquire. Their popularity isn't exactly skyrocketing, so the market for finding one of these guys has settled down around the moderate category, mostly because of the time needed to care for a bunch of them all at once. Just keep in mind that, despite that moderate pricing, you still might have a hard time finding one. Food is an area where you're going to be spending quite a bit. Sure, you are only feeding them small bug-type Pokemon like Caterpie, which are very common and cheap feeder Pokemon, but you're feeding them whole, not in pieces. Combine that with the fact that you're feeding them an average of 1 a day when it comes to Lickitung, and more than that when it comes to Licky, and you're probably looking at the high category, or maybe even the very high category per month. Conclusion. I understand that I may have some bias when it comes to these Pokemon thanks to my personal dislike. And I've tried to avoid having that come out through the guide. Looking at it now, through all the information that I've found, I can't say that these Pokemon are bad Pokemon. They certainly aren't great. They're definitely for advanced trainers to take care of thanks to the feeding method and the protective gear you need. But among the crowd of advanced level Pokemon, they're probably one of the easiest. I still may not like them, and will never raise any of them myself, but if you want a Pokemon that has some interesting challenges in its care, but aren't too bad overall, then I can see these being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. I'm still going to think that they're really weird and gross. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the noxious gas Pokemon Coughing and its evolution Wheezing. Have a wonderful night, everyone.